Everyone I've ever visited in the hospital has died within days. Now my daughter just got admitted and she's asking for me. Everyone I visit in the hospital dies. Not eventually, not from whatever put them there. They die within days of me walking through their door. My grandmother, my best friend, my coworker who was only in for routine surgery, my neighbor who was supposed to go home the next morning. 4 people in 3 years, and by the 4th I knew it wasn't a coincidence. I stopped visiting hospitals 12 years ago, and staying away was easy until my 17-year-old daughter Ivy was in a car accident, and suddenly I had to choose between keeping her alive and being there for her. My wife called me from the emergency room. She's conscious and talking and complaining about her leg, she told me. The doctors say she needs surgery, but it's routine and she'll be home within the week. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 2 hours trying to convince myself that this time would be different, that the pattern wasn't real, that I was losing my mind. I drove to the hospital and parked in the lot and stared at the building until visiting hours ended, and then I drove home. There was an emergency at work, I told my wife. I couldn't make it. The next morning she called again. Ivy keeps asking where you are, she said. She wants to show you the cards the nurses made her. I'll be there after lunch, I said, and I wasn't. I sent flowers with a card that said, Daddy loves you, feel better soon, and I hated myself for every word. My wife's voice on the phone went from confused to concerned to cold over the next 2 days, and on the 3rd day she stopped updating me unless I asked. On the 4th day she called me sobbing. Something's wrong, she said. There's an infection and it's not responding to antibiotics. They moved her to a different floor and they're talking about another surgery. Is she okay? I asked. She's scared and she keeps asking why her daddy won't come see her, my wife said. I don't know what to tell her anymore because I don't understand it either. On the 5th day my wife called and I could hear monitors beeping in the background. Her fever spiked to 104 and they're moving her to the ICU, she said, and her voice was shaking so hard I could barely understand her. I still didn't go. On the 6th day, my wife stopped calling entirely, and when I called her she picked up. She's the same, she said, and hung up before I could respond. I paced the house all night checking my phone every few minutes, waiting for the call that would tell me whether I'd saved her or killed her. That night I drove to the hospital and sat in the parking lot watching other families walk through those doors without hesitation. I watched a father carry balloons through the entrance, and I watched a mother run from her car without even locking it, and I watched a little boy sprint ahead of his grandmother because he couldn't wait to see whoever was inside, and I sat there with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, knowing my daughter was somewhere in that building wondering why I wasn't there. On the 7th day, my wife called screaming, and I could hear Ivy in the background. Please, Daddy, please, she was crying. I want my dad. Why won't he come? I grabbed my keys and ran to my car and drove halfway to the hospital before I pulled over on the side of the road because I couldn't breathe. I sat on the shoulder of the highway with the phone pressed to my ear while my 17-year-old daughter begged for me from an ICU bed, and I thought about my grandmother and my best friend and my coworker and my neighbor, and then I turned the car around and drove home. 2 days later, my wife called. She's stable, she said. The infection is responding. She's going to be okay. Her voice was so flat, I barely recognized it. The next morning, she called again. Ivy's being discharged, she said, and she didn't ask if I was coming to pick them up. Ivy came home that afternoon, and I was standing in the living room when she walked through the front door with my wife behind her, still pale and moving slowly with a slight limp, and looking so much smaller than I remembered. What I saw in her face wasn't anger or sadness or confusion. It was nothing. I stepped toward her and she cut me off before I could speak. I was awake for 40 hours thinking I was going to die, she said, and the whole time I kept asking myself what I did to make my own father hate me. I reached for her. Ivy, please, I said, but she stepped back and held up her hand. Don't, she said. I already grieved you. I did it in that hospital bed while I was crying for you and you never came. I'm done. She walked past me toward her room and didn't look back. She's alive. I'm the one who's dead to her.